This is an interview with Mr. Aldridge Willis for the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute's Oral History Project. I'm Dr. Horace Huntley. We're presently at the Civil Rights Institute, downtown Birmingham. Today is February 17, 1997. Mr. Willis, I want to thank you for taking time out of your schedule to come and talk with me this morning about growing up in the Birmingham district. First of all, just let me ask you two general things. Were you born in Birmingham?
Yes, sir. I was born in Birmingham, right over by Legion Field. There's a children's hospital there.
Okay.
And of course, they tore that hospital down and moved it down to on 6th Avenue South. I mean North. Yeah, 6th Avenue South. I'm sorry. Right.
Were your parents originally from Birmingham?
Yes, sir. My mother is from Titusville area, over on Alpha Street, by the swimming pool. And my father came from Sardis, Alabama.
Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm.
What about your siblings? Did you have brothers and sisters?
Yes, sir. I have one sister. And
Is she older or younger?
she's younger. She's 1 year and 1 month and 9 days apart.
Oh, okay.
Right.
Yeah. Well, you were pretty close as you were growing up.
Yes, sir. We were very close. Mom raised us together, and she was supposed to do the things that I was directed her to do. But of course, women have their own minds.
Yeah, many times they don't listen.
They don't listen to
All
us.
the ones.
No, they don't listen to us all the time.
What neighborhood did you grow up in?
I grew up in the Fairfield area, on 6th Street, Fairfield.
And what school did you attend? You started in first grade.
In the first grade, in kindergarten, I attended First Baptist Church in Fairfield, and then from first through the 8th grade, I attended Robinson Elementary School in the Fairfield area. And from there, I went to Fairfield Industrial High School, graduated in 1964 from there.
Tell me about Robinson. What do you remember about the time that you spent at Robinson?
Well, the times I spent at Robinson were good times. They were very, very good times. Sometimes there were some bad times, and the bad times was that my mother was a school teacher there at the time, so I got a lot of things pointed at me that probably I didn't do, and some things I probably did and were overlooked because of her presence there.
So she actually taught at Robinson?
Yes, sir. She taught at Robinson while I was attending school.
Okay, so you lived in Fairfield and she actually taught right there in the neighborhood.
Matter of fact, we were about 4 blocks from Robinson Elementary.
Mm-hmm.
So we didn't have to ride unless it was a cold day. And we just walked to school.
Mm-hmm.
And she walked to school too.
Oh,
Of course, she had to be there a little bit early, and going inside the building, we played out on the school ground until the bell rang for us to go in classes.
were you involved in any extracurricular activities in elementary school?
Yes, sir. I involved myself in the debating society, which we had at Robinson. We had some choirs read by Cleve Eden's sister, Mrs. Eden. She was a teacher there for a while. And I was in certain other organizations, more scholarly type organizations there. And once or twice I got a chance to be the finalist in the spelling bee, not quite the finalist, but in that round, in that last round in the spelling bee. So I was quite active.
Yeah, spelling bees were always big in Birmingham.
Always have been big in Birmingham. And students got quite a delight in being with those.
That's right.
Those programs.
And you went from Robinson to
Fairfield Industrial High School. Right.
What do you remember about your time at Fairfield Industrial?
They were exciting times. They were exciting times. I was a member of the band for a while. I was a drummer. And of course, they were sad times too. You know, as I think back, there were times wherein that we had to attend library. We didn't have a library in the area. We had to go to Dr. Palm's drugstore. Above it was a library, and we had to share a lot of our books with that library there.
So the library was not in the building?
Well, finally, eventually, when I got into the high school, they did have a library which did not have as many books as a public library of Fairfield had sponsored. And for blacks or Negroes, whatever, during that time, had to go to the library that was on the second floor of Dr. Palm's drugstore, and they paid them.
So you could not use the public library at that time?
The public library was down in the city of Fairfield, which most of the whites attended that, all of the whites. And the books that they wanted blacks to have were shipped up from the library in Fairfield up to Dr. Palm's drugstore.
Where was the drugstore located?
It was on the corner of Avenue D and 60th Street in Fairfield.
Right near the school?
Right near the school. Matter of fact, it was about 2 blocks from Fairfield High School, and it was about a block from Robinson Elementary School. So this was really like the public library for blacks at the time? Right. This was the public library for blacks. All blacks, whether they were high school or elementary school, had to use that public library right above the drugstore.
Right. Tell me about your principal. Who was the principal of
Well, of course, it was the great E.J. Oliver, which he has a boulevard named after him, and he's been principal since the 30s, I believe, all the way on up into the school burned down, which was in the 70s. He was a principal. I think there was a little short interim span in there where he wasn't a principal, but for the most part, he knew everybody. He knew everybody, and he was a principal, E.J. Oliver.
What kind of man was he?
Mr. Oliver was a great man, as I can look back. He led us educationally, academically, he led us spiritually. Every Monday and Friday we had assembly. On Mondays, I remember the song we used to sing, "Get on board, little children, get on board." That was to alert us that we were to be good, well-disciplined, behaved children for the rest of the week. And then on Fridays, I can't recall the song that he would sing, but we would have an assembly every Monday and Friday. Whether we had guests there or not, we always had assembly to kind of alert us to general things that were happening in the community and so forth.
Do you remember any of the guests that would come to assembly?
Yes, a lot of the older students visit the school. We had some people who came in from other areas to visit the school. Not in particularly right now.
You had some rather noted alumnus of
Fairfield
High School.
Oh yes. Well, we've got people like Willie Mays and Dukes. We had, of course, a gentleman that works Birmingham well now, Joe Dixon. He was a member there. Of course, Richard Arrington, the present mayor of Birmingham, graduated from there. We have prominent people all over.
What kind of extracurricular activities were you involved with at the high school?
Well, at the high school, I remember we won the state championship, and I happened to be a junior that year. I participated in football.
In football?
In football. There I was more involved with the scholar type things, honors program, things of that sort, debating society, led by Mrs. Cook Island now. She's deceased. She led us out in a lot of things. Of course, we had something of a semi band and symphony. I think most of those who played string instruments went over to Brighton to get their training, Brighton High School. But we had our little symphony and a band.
So the string instruments would go to Brighton
right,
for rehearsals?
For rehearsals and for because they had more of a formal symphony program there. But we did have a little string instrument for the band in Fairfield.
Now, you graduated in '64,
Yes, sir.
so '63, the year of the demonstrations.
Yes,
How
sir.
did you happen to get involved in the movement?
Well, this is how I started. Basically, the people at what we know as Jackson Olin, Western Olin at that time, came over, and they sort of told us in Fairfield that we had to participate. Mr. Oliver, even though in his greatness, I think from my understanding, was threatened by the Fairfield Board of Education that he, nor his teachers, nor his students were to participate in the civil rights programs. More importantly, well, during 1963, Miles College, from our campus, we can look right into Miles College campus because we set up on a hill. Miles College was more or less down the valley, like from where we sat. They told us that we were to participate, and so I remember this one particular day that we participated in mass numbers. We sort of left the school and we went over to Miles College. It was then led by Mr. Dukes. It was led by Frank Dukes. It was led by the musician who made We Shall Overcome, Mr. Carlton Reese, and some other prominent people. And it was sort of encouraged by Dr. Pitts himself from Miles College that these gentlemen were to lead out in these demonstrations. And from there, I got my growth, my experience, because I participated in the demonstrations that were at Miles. And I remember one particular time that we walked all the way from Miles College down Bessemer Super Highway, which is now 3rd Avenue, down into the Birmingham area to demonstrate and to
You mean there was a group of you marched
Exactly.
from Miles College?
We went over to Miles College, and from Miles College, we marched from Miles College down to the city of Birmingham.
Okay, tell me about the difficulty. Now you're suggesting that that the teachers, the principal, were sort of suggestive that they should not participate.
Yeah.
How, in fact, were you able then to participate? Did you leave school, or did you not go to school that particular day?
Well, when I say teachers did not encourage us, but they did not restrain us that much with all strength. It was like a benign look. Yeah, you go ahead and do it. I'm not telling you to do it, but just, you know what to do. That sort of encouragement and disencouragement at the same time. They didn't get out and try to lead us toward any demonstrations. But I don't think that they turned our names in or tried to do some punitive things to us if we participated.
Were there many students from
Fairfield? Oh, yes, sir. Fairfield turned out in record numbers. We were, even from where we sat, we were strong participants in the civil rights movement. And I think that we were encouraged by looking at the older students that were at Miles College, because many of them lived in the community and a lot of them came over from Birmingham area out there to help us in our growth. And I think from that, looking at the older students, I myself just picked up a great interest in the civil rights movement.
You mentioned that students came over from Western.
Yeah, some students came over from Western. This was Western Olin. They felt that Fairfield was not doing enough participation in the civil rights program. We were doing some things, but we were not loud, verbose with it. We did ours sort of silently, but we were still yet a part of the program. And so this particular day, Western Olin thought that they would put a little more pressure to us. But they didn't have to. They came over, but we were already.
Did they come over to encourage you to leave school?
Well, they encouraged us to leave school, and also with some sort of saying that if we didn't come, our school was going to get rocked, and that was broken the windows. But I think this was more or less a rowdy bunch from Western Oregon that came on to do that. But they didn't have to, because after they saw that we were with the program as we were, we didn't have to. They didn't have to do it.
When that demonstration when you walked from Miles down to 6th Street,
Right.
what took place after you arrived?
Well, generally now, one particular time, I do remember that we were never able to get there. What happens where Midfield City Hall now sits was the old Alabama Highway Patrol sat there. They called themselves that they were going to stop this particular demonstration. And it was led by what's his name? The guy that we should overcome, Carlton Reese. I can't understand, but Carlton's a great guy. And I can't understand why, I guess it's maybe. But anyways, Carlton led out in this demonstration. And so they came up the highway behind us, and some came in front of us with buses, calling themselves to arrest and break up this demonstration, because plans were laid that we were to march down the Bessemer Superhighway, and that we were going to block traffic all the way down to the park, which is a very long way. And somehow or another, the Highway Patrol got wind of that, and they felt like that this is the demonstration. If any was going to be blocked, this would need to be blocked, because I think just about all of Fairfield High School students turned out for this demonstration.
And the superhighway at that time was the thoroughfare.
Was a thoroughfare between
Birmingham and Bessemer.
and all the way on down points below Bessemer,
Right.
all the points south, because that was Highway 5 and Highway 11, which went all the way down to the southern part of the state of Alabama.
So where did they meet you?
Well, right near this church called Pikes Road Baptist Church, and right there called Pike Road in Inslee, right near Sokol's Furniture Store.
Right before you get to 5.
Just before we got to Sokol's Furniture Store, there's a Baptist church, and this is where they thought that it would be best to maybe stop this demonstration before they entered the highway. And so they arrested a lot of us. My mother being a school teacher, I was aware of her job, because a letter had circulated from the Fairfield Board of Education that if any teachers' husbands or wives or teachers' children is caught in the demonstration, that they were going to be terminated. Being a young fellow, I did not know, everything, but I knew not to be arrested. But there were demonstrations that I went purposely to be arrested, and never was arrested, because the police would say, well, we're not taking any more people in today. We're just not taking any more. And so from that, I was never formally arrested. But the students that they did take in, they were housed fenced in at the Birmingham Police Department, which is now on 6th Avenue South. And when they got enough there, then they took them by bus over to what now is known as the Alabama State Fairgrounds. So in there, for some reason, I don't know, I always look bad for myself because I was never arrested. But I wanted to be arrested because I wanted to be a strong participant.
There was a dilemma, though. You wanted to be arrested, but you felt that if you were arrested,
I knew the consequences. You're right. I knew that.
So on that first demonstration, then you were not arrested.
I was not arrested.
But were you attempting to be arrested that particular day, or did you decide that you were not going to be arrested that day?
Well, on that particular day, in the mass number, what happened that they had filled the bus up. So the rest of us was out there, and of course some of us ran. Being young, didn't know which way to go. I ran too. And then I turned them back around to get on the bus, but they were filled and they closed the doors and took these students on down to 6th Avenue South. So we thought maybe we would go over into Birmingham. We got in some private cars and we went over into Birmingham at the park across the street from 16th Street Baptist Church to be arrested because that's where the main demonstration was taking place. So when we got there, there was no one, they were not arresting anybody, just more or less maintaining the crowds from tearing up things, so to speak. So we weren't arrested there. But there were a number of us who wanted to be arrested. Wanted to, I guess, give our part, do our part in filling up the jails.
Were there other demonstrations that you participated in?
Oh, yes, sir. There was several. One of the mass demonstrations, which you will often see this as in movies, there's a series of movies that came out about 4 or 5 different films. I forgot the name of the series.
Eyes on the Prize.
Right, Eyes on the Prize, right, where they were arresting people and shooting water in there. And that demonstration I did take part. And as I was going across the street on that particular day.
Tell me first, before you get to the actual demonstration.
Yes.
Where did it start? Were you at 16th Street Baptist Church? Did you have any instruction on what to do during the demonstration? Or was it a group of students that came down and just got involved?
Right. Now there were instructions at 16th Street Baptist Church as to what to do. But but the place was filled up. So therefore we didn't get into the formal instructions of that day.
So you were outside?
So we were outside. And then when the students came from out of 16th Street Baptist Church to go into the park to do their demonstrations of nothing more than prayer, not to tear up, there around them were policemen and fire trucks. And then when the prayer service and singing service got underway, then they began to unleash these dogs on the people of that day. And I was down there. So I didn't get in on the formal instructions, but we had come to 16th Street Baptist Church to get in formal instructions as to how to conduct ourselves. From listening to people, we weren't not to fight back or strike back, but we were to offer ourselves up for prayer and for song service. And that was it.
And then you left the church.
Right. We were left the church, we stepped across the street to the park. And by the time we got to the park, because there were thousands of people there, the policeman gave an order that these people were to be contained, that they were not to be out in the street. Then the firemen, for some odd reason, received word that they were to turn loose these fire hoses. And I witnessed these fire hoses were so powerful. And when they turned them up into the trees, these fire hoses would just cut limbs like an invisible hand. They just cut limbs, knock down trees. It was like an invisible hand. The fire hoses were under pressure or water. So, therefore, it was so many people in the park that we were told to go across the street where Freedom Manor now sit, and that's where I was. And at Freedom Manor, we were to sing and pray there while the other people took their positions in the park. And the dogs were at these people that were in the park. And then when they felt like they had arrested enough people in the park, then we were to come across the street and join. So it was like waves of people were to take their part in the demonstrations. But we were hampered by the fact that when the fire hoses were turned on, somebody threw, and I saw it, one of the young men took a bottle, like a Coca-Cola bottle, threw it at the fireman that was spraying the water on the demonstrators and hit the fireman on the head, and the only thing protecting him was his helmet. And when he saw that, he just turned the hoses on us who were on this side, so we were cut down. My body was picked up, I guess, again, I can only imagine like a visible hand because of the force of the water. My legs were knocked out from under me, and I fell to the ground and people running and screaming and so forth. I did get trampled on some, but I was little, I was strong, I was willing. Then again, we didn't get arrested that day. But you could see that we were there. And I was kind of hurt a little bit, but not as much as on the inside as to what they were doing to people in the park.
What was the reaction of your parents as a result of your being involved?
Well, again, like I said, I grew up in a middle-class neighborhood as far as I can see. My mother was somewhat fearful of losing her job. Now, she did not give me strong instructions. You better not get arrested. But now you know the consequences if you did get arrested, if you did, and so not embarrass me, but if you did bring, your name up, and then the superintendent of Fairfield Board of Education hear that, then you know the consequences of my job. It was something like that. And being, I would say, bullheaded, but because of my own initiatives and wanted to be a strong participant in the demonstrations, I went on anyways. Now, personally, I was involved in a lot of planning because I'll never forget Frank Dukes, and I'm calling some names, this printer I was telling you about. Mm-hmm. What they wanted to do, we were going to A.G. Gaston's motel, not in the not in the tavern or bar park, but back there where the dinner was served and plans were being laid. And I was highly privileged to sit in on these demonstrations. And the planning part, as to what was to take place and who was to move forward. It was a very organized effort to put more pressure
What
on
were
the
some of the
demonstration.
plans? Can you remember any specifics in terms of planning for the demonstration?
Okay, yes, sir. At times, what they had was a chart of different groups. Some were church groups, some were high schools, some were different sororities and fraternities had their names, who volunteered their bodies per se as to when they were demonstrating. Then times were laid out as to which group was to be in place at a certain area in and around, I guess, the park that's across the street from 16th Street Baptist Church. And that was some of the plans that I saw were being laid out.
So you're saying that sororities?
Some sororities, some fraternities. At that time, I was aware of particular names of different groups, but I remember them saying, well, such and such group is to be there, let's say at 9 a.m., or this group is to be there at 11, and you're to do your singing. But at all times, they were cautioned not to fight back, not to be non-violent. It was been cautioned. Right. And no matter what was said or what was done to you, the idea was not to fight back, but to be in these places, to do your singing, to do your praying, and also I printed some signs of Freedom Now, Freedom Today. I printed some of those signs as a young person, and of course we had the different black paints and markers and things of that sort to be there.
Did you attend any of the mass meetings?
Yes, sir. I attended some mass meetings at 16th Street Baptist.
How would you describe a mass meeting?
Well,
for children today who really never had the privilege of attending a mass meeting and you want to get that information over to them, what would you tell them?
It's a strange feeling. You knew what was going on, you could see what was going on. But until you got there and got the singing and began to hear the speeches, you were caught up in a fever pitch. Some of the ministers and civil rights people were able to bring out and make crystal clear what was taking place. I cannot say that I received all of the segregational things were going on because, like I said, I grew up personally in a middle class neighborhood, and the middle class blacks were. Frankly speaking, I didn't see whites at all until something official was taking place, like a fireman would come in, or some arrest was taking place by the police. Most of the middle class people in Birmingham, I think, just dealt with blacks. There was a middle class neighborhood during this time. Your haircut, everything that you needed, schooling, education, businesses, were all sponsored by middle class. So, but the speakers, going back, the speakers who were up talking made it crystal clear as to what our people were suffering, how people were being mistreated over the mountains, because a lot of times, a lot of people had to go to the mountains to work. The middle class neighborhoods of Birmingham was sheltered from that. And when these speakers would get up, they would speak about these atrocities and how people were being kicked, how they were being cursed on the job, how they were being belittled on the job. And these speakers were able to make this image come clear. Then you knew what was going on. And when you start singing about these different activities and begin to hear these speakers, you were caught up in a fever pitch. It was hypnotic. Sometimes you would forget about consequences. Sometimes you didn't really care as to what happened to me, as long as we make it clear that we are demonstrating for rights which we rightly deserve. And in addition to that, being a young person, not having a family to depend upon me, I was more at liberty to do whatever I wanted. But like I said, the only thing, and having these tendencies to fight back, because it did not matter to me personally, and I think to a lot of other people around my age, whether we heard a policeman or saw him dead on the street, it did not matter. But we were cautioned through these spiritual-minded people not to be violent. And in these mass singing and program and looking at these different people would come up and testify how they were mistreated, how some were arrested unnecessarily, just being on the street corners at certain times, arrested and taken advantage of. You were just caught up in a fever pitch. To the young people nowadays, it's kind of hard to imagine because they're being oppressed one way, but not because that they're black, and in a way they are, but not because they're what they are, but because of what they do. But we were oppressed as a people, and so I can only say that it's the young people that maybe they need to look at some of the things that we older people have done. And I'm not too far removed from them.
That's right. You mentioned that you were from a middle class neighborhood.
Yes.
And your family was basically middle class.
Right.
Your mother, did she go to Miles?
My mother went to Miles for 2 years, and then she went to Alabama State for the last 2 remaining years, because I think during her time, that's where all of the teachers had to go down to Alabama State. So she went there for 2 years, and then Alabama State for 2 years.
What about your father's education?
Now, my father only graduated from the 8th grade.
And what kind of work did he do?
He was a steel worker. And he read extensively. He loved the Bible. I think a lot of his training came out of the Bible, so to speak. And he was quite read. Matter of fact, more so than my mother. And he would be able to tell me a lot of things through his readings. So he was a United States steel worker, and he read extensively, and he made a good salary at that time.
You know, that was probably one of the top salaries in the city at the time.
Yes, sir. Because during that time, if you did not work for the steel mills, as an uneducated person, you just didn't make it. The top jobs were either school teachers, a few doctors, most of them worked for the post office. The mass of the middle class people either worked for one or the other board of education, either Fairfield or Birmingham Board of Education.
After you returned from demonstrating,
Yes.
how were you accepted by your teachers and by other students that maybe did not demonstrate?
Well, I was received well. There was not, like I said, everybody knew pretty much what was going on. We were not castigated for our efforts in being a demonstrator. But we were somewhat cautioned that, hey, you better watch out. You know, they might got your name down or something like that, or they might take your picture. That sort of feeling that you got, that you were being watched. Teachers that were, during that particular time, like I said, they took a benign look at you. They wanted to do it themselves, but did not have the courage to do what they needed to do, for their jobs were very much at stake. I felt good. I felt like I was a good soldier, even though, like I said, I didn't receive the full blunt like I wanted to. But we were there.
You participated
We
in
were
your
participants.
contribution.
Right.
What did you do after graduating from high school?
Well, after graduating from high school, I went off to Oakwood College. It's a private Southern Adventist college in Huntsville. And there, that year, I remember in one of my last years, I think, I had been a volunteer with Robert Kennedy's campaign. Near the end of my school year, Martin Luther King himself was killed, I think in April. And of course, we had some demonstrations in Huntsville, Alabama, regarding that. But Huntsville was not as dire in their hatred toward blacks like Birmingham was. Birmingham was a hard nut to crack. Huntsville had its segregational parts, but they were yet open because of, I guess, of the Redstone Arsenal there, and the federal government having its presence there was not as hard of a place to live in as Birmingham. So we, as students at Oakwood College, we did our demonstrations. And from there...
But you didn't meet a Bull Connor?
No, there was no Bull Connors per se there. You had your racist people, but not staunch. Because the people who had anything in Huntsville worked at the Arsenal, and that these people were basically from the North. And so therefore they were not as crystallized to hate, or let's say like this, to do outward and activities against you as a black person, like here in Birmingham. And so consequently, they were a lot more open in Huntsville, but they still have their problems. We oftentimes at Oakwood College, we would join in with the students from Alabama A&M to make our presence there in Huntsville. And we would go down to a place called, a radio station called We Up, which was several blocks from Oakwood's college campus.
What was it called?
We Up, W-E-U-P. I don't know whether you know of that or not, W-E-U-P, radio station. Matter of fact, the gentleman that started W-E-U-P was from Birmingham, so oftentimes we would go down and we would do our speeches on radio, cut tapes, records, whatever, about things that were taking place in Huntsville.
So you were an activist.
I would consider myself as an activist. I've always wanted to do something, and so I would do the paperwork, the scholar parts of the thing, and so that's just how it was.
What did you do after college?
Well, after college, of course, another thing that I did, I was drafted into the military. Remember, that was the time of the civil rights movement. It was a bad times for the United States because we were Vietnam War was taking place at that particular time.
And this was actually the time that Dr. King, I think in '67, I believe, he came out against the war in Vietnam.
Yes, sir. He came out against the war in Vietnam because he felt that blacks, not that to me, from my understanding and knowledge of Dr. King, he felt like that we had a lot of work to do here in the United States, and that it was not an anti-American movement, as some people would like to consider Dr. King as, but it was more or less that he felt that we should do some more work here in the United States toward civil rights rather than focus ourselves against trying to protect Vietnamese people from communism taking over in Vietnam. So he never came out with anti-American ideas.
But he was anti-war.
He was anti-war, but not anti-American. Anti-American, that's the idea that I want to leave, the people.
So you were drafted.
I was
into the Army?
drafted, right, I was drafted.
And
There,
that experience.
I was drafted in the military, and of course, I did not have any idea because I knew nothing about what was happening in Vietnam. There, I did not go to Vietnam. I went to Korea, and there I served for 3 years. And of course, there was a couple of incidents that took place in Korea that we felt that.
Like what kind of incidents?
Well, during the demonstrations in the United States were taking place towards civil rights, there were 1 or 2 incidents that took place which needed to be addressed in Korea. And some of the blacks, one of the things was that they did not want us to take off. There was a great push on to recognize Martin Luther King's Day in the military. Military at that time did not want to recognize that day. So we had to take it off as a sick day. And some of us did, and I did too, of course. But instead of going to sick call, we went to a area on the post, or camp is what they would call it, and we demonstrated. There, helicopters were flying around. We had the military police there to see that nothing would do anything that would endanger the United States forces in Korea. And after this demonstration was so peaceful, and then again, a lot of singing, a lot of hand waving, and so forth. Some of the people that were there were Black Panthers. And of course, they would do their sign.
In Korea?
In Korea.
Were they
But this was not against the
soldiers?
Koreans. Yes, sir, they were soldiers.
Okay.
They had some black berets or whatever around their arms, and they would hold the power sign up. I guess that frightened some of the officers there. But after that demonstration turned out as peaceful as it did, was nothing said. And of course, the MPs went away, the helicopters went away. So that was one or two things there, and that was it, other than that. And then, of course, an order came down from the general's office who was serving at that particular time that Martin Luther King Day will be recognized as an official holiday. So I served in a peacetime, yet, during wartime in Korea.
So you were in the military for 3 years or 4 years?
I opted to go for the 2 years. I was one of the blacks that passed this test to become an officer, but I was in school in New York. Matter of fact, I was in law school at State University of New York in Buffalo when I got drafted. And so therefore, to take out any time for the military of officers candidate school, I just thought I would do my 2 years. And we had to serve 13 months in Korea. And then we would get a 5-month drop, because the only time that you had was 24 months. Then we would get a 4 or 5 month drop from the military if we were in school or we were
in school, 5-month drop.
in other words, what I meant was that because that you had served at least 1 year and a month overseas, then you would come back to the United States and you would ETS, or estimated time of service, out. Get out of the military at that time.
So you actually spent 2 years in the Army?
In the military, yes, sir.
Okay. And were you an officer?
At that time, I was not an officer. I went back later on to the National Guard, and I became an officer, second lieutenant after that. But I didn't do it in the active service. I did it in the National Guard.
Well, when you left the military, did you come back to Birmingham?
No, sir. I remained in New York. I remained in New York, and I was first in Buffalo. Then I went up to, before leaving, right after leaving Buffalo, I went over into Vermont, the state of Vermont, and there I took a test and I became a correctional officer. I was the first black correctional officer for the state of Vermont that they ever had, and that was back in 1971.
Why did you?
74, I'm sorry, 74.
Why did you go to Vermont? Did you go to Vermont
Right.
for the purpose of becoming an
Well,
officer?
at that time, no, I went to Vermont because in the military, you talk to fellow soldiers and they tell you about different other places. And I just had that wild streak in the bohemian spirit to wander and live in other parts of the United States. I had befriended a white person, and this was my first, being in the military was my first introduction into the white race. Up until that time, like I said, I grew up in a largely middle-class neighborhood in which blacks depended upon each other. And so therefore, we did not have to depend solely upon whites for our suscitation. So therefore, by being in the military, gave me some introduction into what the white race was all about, because I really didn't know anything about it.
Right.
A lot of things I had been told about whites as a youth were not so.
Like for instance?
They don't have any bugs. They keep their house very clean. They don't do this and do that, so to speak. They are very disciplined, But after being in the military and watching them, I'm saying, well, I was told by Granny, I was told by Miss Sally that white people didn't do that. But I began to find out that, no, white people have some same things as we do, and some problems as we do in family and other things too. But like I said, I had befriended this white gentleman, and I moved into Vermont just to see what Vermont was like. And there in Vermont, there were only 100 blacks in the whole state. I looked at the population. This was during 1974. I'm sorry, there were 500 blacks. 100 lived in Burlington, where I lived. And most of them worked for IBM company at that time. And if it had not been for IBM moving blacks up there to work, I don't think the state of Vermont would have seen hardly any blacks. And I was surprised because in certain parts of the state of Vermont, they had never seen a black person. I was one of their first black people that they had seen. And of course, the kids always would come up and sort of look at it, and strangely in a way. Because up there, their demonstrations, the Anglos have a terrible problem with French Canadians. They look upon French Canadians as quote unquote the niggers of the white race. Mm-hmm. So they really didn't have time to focus on blacks per se, because their hatred was against the French Canadians who spoke French. So therefore, in certain parts of Vermont, I was accepted. And in other parts of Vermont, I was not accepted. Not because I was black, but because I hadn't lived in Vermont, which they have a mystique about them, that if you hadn't been in that particular area over 20 years and your family didn't come from there, you were not considered as a New Englander. I was fortunate enough to run into a black gentleman that owned a tremendous amount of apartments in Vermont. And he was kind of well-to-do. And oftentimes we had conversations together because his family, relating his history back, had never been in the South. So he knew nothing. His ideas about and knowledge about blacks in the Deep South was just as strange as some of the whites there, because his family had never been in the South. They had, quote unquote, has always been free, so to speak. So it was interesting to relate the story of the South to him. And I like to feel like that I contributed to his knowledge about his people in the South.
How long did you live there?
I lived there for 3 years in Vermont.
Were you in corrections?
I was in corrections. I was in corrections till I was able to pass the state bar for lawyering. But I wasn't successful because I didn't venture out on my own. And I moved back to New York, which I never practiced law. Back to New York, but down in Long Island area. I didn't practice law there in New York. And there were some things that I did there. And then even in New York, I was one of the first blacks, because I always stayed on Long Island rather than moving to the city, New York. New York City had its own blacks and their own sort of things, but out in Long Island was still rural. And I was surprised to find out that even in Long Island, there was areas in which blacks were contained in. One was Wyandanch. I lived in Amityville, which had a substantial number of blacks. Amityville. And of course, in Wyandanch, where blacks lived, I became a teacher in Wyandanch. And I stayed there for a number of years. And then my father took sick here in Alabama, and he was encouraged to move back to Alabama. So I sort of been around.
Right. And when you came back to Alabama, did you come back and immediately get a job as a teacher?
No, sir, I didn't. I had several ideas in my mind. I worked first as a court officer in Jefferson County Family Court. And then, of course, I worked I worked full-time for the Jefferson County Police Department, Sheriff's Department, right? And
How did you do that?
I was a sheriff which worked in the jail part, preparing myself to go out on patrol one day. But I used to do a substantial amount of substitute work because I worked at night, and I worked a lot for the City of Birmingham Public Schools. And I saw so many black youth being arrested for various things. But when I went to the schools during the day, and I could see the same mentality and the same spirit, the same activities that these older blacks were doing that I had to arrest and maintain in the jails, I said, I could do something better and try to help educate these younger blacks not to do that. So I would work in the schools during the day, and I think I did a lot of work at Daniel Payne. I did some at Hayes. Hayes was a high school at that time, and several other schools throughout. And I did some work in Jefferson County, minor high school, and so forth. And everywhere I went, I tried to take young black males aside and say, hey, you know, let's do it this way. Until finally one day, I got in trouble because two black students got to fighting, and I told them that they shouldn't be doing that. This was in my high school, and it was two females, and I told them, I said, you're a black young ladies, and I don't think you really should do that. And but for some odd reason, they got a little angry. Not one of them got a little angry with me because they felt that I was taking the side of another. And she went to the principal and said, hey, he's preaching racial ideas. And so I sort of stopped that. Then I still, in an indirect way, I would still try to tell, you know,
What did the principal say to you?
well, the principal came up and he felt that, he said that, that I was encouraging racial activities at the school. I was not dismissed or anything like that because I was only substituting. But he felt like that I should be more equal in my talk to students, teach them as students, not as black students. But I felt that since they were in largely a predominant white school, that some encouragement needed to take place among black youth. And so, you know, from there, I felt like that my services would not long be needed
Were you
if
invited?
I could not teach my own young people to be black people, you know.
Were you invited back to minor?
Yes, I was invited back to minor high school, but I didn't take it up. I started focusing my attention more toward the Birmingham public schools, where largely blacks were, and therefore we did not have those same problems in the Birmingham public schools. Then I could focus in on academics. But I had to demonstrate to the black young people how to be best behaved, because every time when students acted up, they were not seen as students, they were seen as black students. And oftentimes I would have to go and break up fights. I was called to the scene by some white teacher. Said, well, since you're black, the black student was fighting, can't you say a word to him? So that's why I wanted to talk to black students per se, until one of the young ladies started saying, well, he's being racial. And I think this was her way of getting back at me. So then the principal came and he felt that I should not pass on to any of the students about being black. But I told him, sir, I want to only try and teach these students how to behave as black youth in a predominantly white school. And after he found out my objectives, that's why I was invited back to continue working at minor high school.
So you're now teaching full-time?
I'm teaching full-time in Birmingham, and I'm very proud of that fact. Very, very proud of the fact that I am teaching in Birmingham. There's a lot of work to do. There's a lot of work needs to be done. I enjoy working with our youth. Some of them are very adroit, very skillful. And I think that if they have the opportunity to do advanced work, and they can be just as better as any other youth that I've seen, you know, in my experiences. And I just feel the need to work with this community, these youth of Birmingham. But it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work.
Mr. Willis, I want to thank you for taking time out of your schedule. I know today is your day off,
Yes, sir.
and I'm sure you have other things that you could be doing.
Oh, yeah.
I appreciate your time.
Yeah. But wherever I can share my experiences past, they were somewhat limited. And of course, there's some things that I didn't get into because they were more melodramatic and I think not need to be shared. But wherever I can share my experiences of my civil rights participation, I'm always glad to do it.
Thank you.
Yes.